hosted by the David L. Boren College of International Studies, African Studies Institute. Today we'll be discussing the double pandemics of anti-Black racism and health, particularly surrounding this year. We'll be receiving perspectives of such from students at the University of Oklahoma representing Africa and the diaspora. So to start, I'll be introducing myself and the panelists tonight. My name is Joya Takpo, and I am a junior majoring in biology. I am also the current president of the African Student Association here at OU. Our first panelist tonight is Munashe Matsaranyika. She's a senior majoring in international and area studies, who is also the judicial board chair for the International Advisory Committee. Our second panelist is Pedro Manuel, who is in his second year of his master's program in public administration. Our third panelist is Tatenda Jimbo, a senior in the Accelerated Master's Program in Economics. She is also the president and founder of the African Women's League. And our fourth and final panelist is Sean Hardrick, who has his master's in education and is an academic counselor for Project Threshold at OU. So each panelist will have 10 minutes for each topic, and then at the end we'll have time for questions in the crowd. So if you guys have any questions while we're talking or have anything to ask, there's a Q&A section at the bottom. And if you guys see any questions that you like, you can upvote them. So we'll probably be asking the questions that get the most upvotes at the end. So to begin from Munashe, your question is, although the current version of Black Lives Matter was founded in the US, it has rapidly become a global phenomenon, especially over the past couple of years. What do you think are the most important points or perspectives that global voices, particularly those in Africa, have added to the movement?
Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who's watching. If you'll permit me, I'll just share my screen really quick. Okay, so talking about global Black Lives Matter, and today I'm going to give just a little bit of a both a global perspective, but also an African perspective. And I'll just do a very quick overview of what the Black Lives Matter movement is. So the movement was sparked by the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2013 due to police brutality. And it started off as a hashtag, and then later on it developed into a movement that was a response to ongoing segregation and violence that Black people face in the United States. And according to the website itself, the mission of the movement is to eradicate anti-Blackness and to empower Black people socially, economically, and politically. And this third point is what I would like us to pay attention to, because that's what I will be using to look at what that looks like from a global perspective and what that looks like from an African perspective. And as you all know, the murder of George Floyd this year in May 2020 sparked probably what is the largest and the most exponential push for the movement and support for the movement, not just in the United States, where almost every single state held protests, but also globally. And so essentially we want to answer the question, how has the movement's origins and mission translated across different countries, particularly those on the African continent? And looking at a brief overview of the global impact. So the first thing that I think a lot of us have noticed is that the global implications of multinational corporations was felt during, particularly during the George Floyd protests. And this is because domestically, the Black Lives Matter movement can be a little bit problematic or controversial, and companies tend to not want to respond or to show support. But because of the ongoing pressure that was really placed on multinational corporations to make a stand, not just by Black people in the United States, but by Black people across the continent of Africa and just across the globe, this added to the need for there to be a substantive agreement on whether or not Black lives actually matter.
Munashe, I just want to ask you to make sure that you show the screen you want to show, because we see your whole screen, but not the actual presentation. If you could click on the presentation itself.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. And so, you know, just looking at that, we see from Facebook to Mercedes-Benz, in every single country, they have to take a stand. And that has an implication on not just the subsidiary country, companies themselves, but on the consumers in every single country that have to understand where their product, the company that produces the products that they buy, where they stand. But beyond that, we also look at point number 2, where another response to the Black Lives Matter movement was international protests in support of what's going on in America. So not just people looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and just questioning what's going on in America, but also responding with protests and showing their support. So we see protests from Korea, from China, sorry, not China, but from Korea to France, all the way to Zimbabwe. There were even protests, you know, across every single continent, over 60 countries protesting the murder of George Floyd, showing that Black Lives Matter has transitioned from just a movement where people are protesting within one country, but showing support outside of the United States as well. And then from there, we see a slow transition of the movement, which is the third point, from protesting about American issues to translating Black Lives Matter to fit domestic needs. And we saw this in Germany and London in 2016, where they each held protests against police brutality, and minorities held protests against police brutality of their own accord, and protesting police brutality in London, protesting police brutality in Germany. Even in Israel, Ethiopian Israelis also protested the discrimination that the Black Israeli community faced and continues to face in 2016. And another more contemporary example is the most recent Zimbabwean Lives Matter in 2020, where it really shows that translation of what is a global movement that began in America and translating that to local needs, where it wasn't just about arbitrary Black lives mattering, but specifying that Zimbabwean lives matter in response to, again, police brutality and oppression. So these are some of like the stages that we see of what the global response and the global impact of the Black Lives Matter movement is. And the last point is a little bit of a problematic point, but it is a point that we need to discuss nonetheless, and that a lot of African intellectuals have mentioned, is the disconnect between support for the Black community in America and the lack of reciprocity for Black Africans. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So what does Black Lives Matter look like on the continent of Africa itself? If we go back to the mission of the Black Lives Matter movement, which I talked about early on, we can summarize it as the goal is to dismantle anti-Blackness and to empower Black people socially, economically, and politically. So then that raises the question of, are Black Africans socially, economically, and politically empowered? And is the police brutality and totalitarianism that we see on the continent a function of racism and anti-Blackness? And if so, if Black Africans are not socially, economically, and politically empowered, and if the police brutality and totalitarianism that we see on the continent is a function of racism and anti-Blackness, then is Black Lives Matter, is the movement Black Lives Matter doing the same thing on the African continent as it is doing, or as it is trying to do in the United States? And so an article by Arel Bining claims that Africa is consistently supporting African-American issues when it comes to Black Lives Matter, but is also consistently absent from the analysis and the explicit concerns of the movement. And this is a little bit disconcerting because the movement itself has gained an upsurge in support and gained an upsurge in advocacy, even from the continent. But we don't see that same bringing in of African issues into the narrative of Black Lives Matter. And I believe it was Malcolm X who was speaking at an African Union conference, and he said issues of African Americans in America are inherently African issues, because Africans in the diaspora are equally part of the African narrative, and so should be treated as such. And so I will look at two specific voices that have spoken into this dynamic between African Americans and the Black Lives Matter movement in America, and what that looks like on the African continent. And just before I delve into that, Joy, will you please let me know when my time is close to up?
Yes, you have about 3 more minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so I will start with Wandile Kasibe. And Wandile Kasibe has done a lot of work with the Black Lives Matter movement representatives and activists in South Africa. But he's also most notably known for him leading the Roads Must Fall movement in South Africa, and the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa as well. And essentially, his main belief system is that Africans and those of African descent together should deal with the challenges that face us, because the challenges that face us are not so different. And this means that if we go back to the mission of the BLM movement, is that the dismantling of anti-colonial legacies is similar to the dismantling of systemic racism, because they are both rooted in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And so when we look at police brutality in Africa, and we look at how the state is often an agent of violence towards the people. If we look at Zimbabwe, for example, the institution of the state and of the police is a function of white supremacy and of anti-Blackness, because it is rooted, and it was its foundation are in colonial control. And so you find that the methods that totalitarian governments and these institutions that are put in place use against their own people are rooted in the same power dynamics that existed during colonization, which is what Wandile tries to bring about, that our issues are actually they're actually more similar than they are dissimilar. And another intellectual I will talk about is Rachel McCallie, who also agrees with Wandile. And she is a Kenyan activist who brings in more of like the social and economic aspect of the conversation. So if we go back to the mission of the BLM movement, as I mentioned before, if it is to empower Africans economically, socially, and politically, the next question would be, are Africans empowered socially and economically? And Rachel argues that the social dynamics and the social barriers, even among Black people, make that cause as a conflict in empowering Black people in general on the continent. And so she has the example that a privileged or wealthy Black man or woman has more of a voice than an underprivileged woman, and that the social, economic, and political empowerment of Black people then must take into consideration this intersectionality between, you know, we can say Black people in Africa, oh, they are empowered, they run their own governments, they run their own countries, but is it working in favor of the majority of the people? Are we taking the intersectional issues into account when we talk about the empowerment? And if not all Black people on the continent are empowered, then are Black Africans truly empowered at all? And so I will just summarize in brief the things I've talked about. Essentially, the fight against discrimination and violence against Black bodies is not unique to the United States. Like I mentioned before, we have violence against Black Africans by the state, and those are also rooted in the same issues and in the same structures. And the BLM movement's mission to dismantle anti-Blackness and to empower Black people applies to Black Africans as well. And it is important to note that even among Black Africans, there are different social and economic barriers that oppress Black Africans in ways that we need to acknowledge, we need to address, and we need to speak about. And lastly, this mission to dismantle anti-Blackness and to empower Africans or Black people socially, economically, and politically should be encouraged both by minorities of African descent across the globe and Black people on the continent in mutual support of one another. And so thank you so much for your time. That is a summary of the points that I've talked about today.
Perfect. Thank you, Menashe. So now we will move on to Pedro. Your question is, do you think the US-based protests against anti-Black racism and social injustice more broadly have affected the way in which youth from different countries think about race, identity, and protest in the 21st century?
Thank you very much, Joy, and everybody who is participating. First of all, I think Munashe just spoke whatever I wanted to speak. And she did a good job in explaining and bringing the international perspective of the conversation. And that's a favor to me. So thank you, Munashe. But I would like to start by offering just a very known definition of race, which we all understand that comes from a biased point of view. Some people define race as a fabrication, a social fabrication to classify people on base of skin color, physical features, and ultimately divide them into superiors and inferiors. And in the US, we have a country that is racialized. People are assigned a race, and your race matters to the end of your life. If we see how we perceive race in the United States, it's very different from how we perceive race in Angola, from how we perceive race in Brazil, for instance. In the US, as far as I'm concerned, if somebody in your family was a Black person or a Native American, and your grandfather, your father, and your mom are white, you are not white. You are something else. Why? Because it's very important for the oppressors, in other words, for those who control the discourse, to make sure that not many people are part of the discourse, the dominant discourse community, which ultimately are the Caucasian white people. So the notion of race that we have today was intentionally constructed to divide us. And then many other things that I'm gonna talk about came, which is economic empowerment and even access to basic services and goods. And then what's identity? Identity is basically how we see ourselves and how other people look at us. It's basically the conclusion, I would say the product of our own experiences, our families, our workplace, our schools, and everything we do in our lives will ultimately make who we are as a person. And our identity is far more than our race. It includes our gender, our sex, and even our class. So in the United States, our race tells a lot about our identity. And there is a study that was done by the Pew survey, and they actually show that Black people tend to respond that their race plays a significant role on their identity than white people. And it just says a lot on how much Black people think of race and white people think of race. So in order to respond your question, I just want to say that the Black Lives Matter movement is certainly impactful. And as Munashe has said, it has basically provided us with so many resources, even the language, to discuss about race in many senses. What's true though, is that as Munashe said, in Africa and many other parts of the world, we have talked about race before the Black Lives Matter movement. And even mass protests, mass civil rights movements, or I would say mass youth movements against oppression didn't start with Black Lives Matter movement. In 2010, early 2010, we had the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring essentially was against oppressive regimes in the Middle East. And it started in Africa, in Tunisia, and then spread across the region. So people somewhere else has thought about how to fight against oppression and discrimination and inequality in the society. But what the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to us is how people mobilize and some of the reasons why these people mobilize. And I just want to emphasize that the Black Lives Matter movement is a continuation of a freedom struggle that has started from the freedom fighters in Africa, and then African Americans here in the 50s and 60s, and then to our time. But the Black Lives Matter movement not only has a decentralized leadership that the civil rights movement didn't have, but they also have the social media that helps them to mobilize more quickly and more efficiently. And I think that the skills and the language that they have provided to us really has impacted how youth around the globe thinks about race and identity. And as Munashe mentioned, after the late protests that we had after the death of Mr. Floyd, youth around the world organized and demonstrated against race. And why is that important? It's important because we are more and more realizing that even though we are not from the same nation, from the same country, we share a much bigger thing. We are from a much bigger group. For instance, when I came to the United States, I didn't think of race the way I think today. And you will find a lot of Africans saying that BLM is an American thing and therefore they have to fight themselves because we are fighting ourselves. But being here in the US, you understand that African Americans are not hated, are not killed because they are African Americans. They are hated and killed because they are Black. And therefore, me as an African, a Black African man, this is my problem too. It takes experience for you to understand that this is your problem too. And the Black Lives Matter movement has exposed racism in the US through social media. And it resonated to young people somewhere else who, in fact, experienced the same things. They just didn't have the language in many parts, right? They just didn't have the language to talk about those kind of things. And in Angola, just like in Zimbabwe and many other countries, we also have systemic oppression that comes from the government. We also have policy brutality. But for many years, we ignored many of these issues because we feared the government, because we thought whatever we do would not make any difference. But we watched how the US, how the BLM movement has changed things. Why is BLM so important though? Because it's based in the United States of America. And whether we accept it or not, the US is the hegemonic power, and people in the US have more resources than most people elsewhere. So given that you have access to the internet and social media more easily, whatever you do here will send a very significant message to those outside. So this is why it sometimes seems like the Black Lives Matter movement has started something that we already had somewhere else, if I make myself clear. But at the same time, I would say that yes, the Black Lives Matter movement has trained us on how to use social media more efficiently. And last week in Angola, we had, I think, about six demonstrations against police brutality. And this is something that we didn't have before. And I will admit that all these protests were influenced by what happened in the United States of America. So all in all, I would say that the Black Lives Matter movement has been teaching us of how racism is still alive, how much racism is still alive in the US, and how much our race is tells a lot about us, and how it can be a determinant factor on whether we are accepted or not. But also, this movement has demonstrated that young people are not accepting racism and discrimination as much as older people. And if we see the recent demonstrations, they were racially and ethnically diverse, more diverse than all demonstrations that we have seen. And it just says that young people are tired. And they are not only tired in the US, but they are tired elsewhere. And these protests here, in a way, have brought more people together than divided, even though we have so many divisions too. I believe that so many white people in the US and elsewhere have come to the conclusion that racism is bad, discrimination is bad, and when Black people are better off, everybody in the society will be better off. The Black Lives Matter movement also taught us that we not only fight against racism, but we fight against all kind of discrimination in the society. This is why we will see different kind of groups fighting alongside the Black Lives Matter movement. We will see the LGBTQ community and our Latinx friends, Indian Americans coming together because they understand that the problem is much bigger than the Black community. So if you could tell me how many minutes I have left, that will be helpful.
If you want to start wrapping it up now,
Right.
if you're able to.
Yeah, thank you. So just to summarize and really to finish, I just wanted to say that the Black Lives Matter movement has an organized group to fight systemic discrimination in the society. Has really shown everybody, not just in the US, but elsewhere, that protests really work. But we cannot end up there. We have to do more. This is why the Black Lives Matter movement has really impacted the political discourse here. And it really sent a very important message to youth outside the US that they also have to identify themselves and have to be proud of who they are, of their race, and really utilize whatever resources they have to empower themselves and other people. And we'll have Tatenda speak just after me. And Tatenda initiated the African Women's League. African Women's League is, in other words, a continuation of this acceptance of your Blackness, of who you are on your own skin, on your own body. And this is one of the importance of the BLM movement. You are a person, you have to be valued, and you have to be your first advocate. And basically, it has given people voice and an understanding of who they are and what the oppressors are thinking of them and how they can fight against them. So I think that's what I wanted to say, and I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Pedro. Okay, now we're going to move to Tatenda. And your question is, notably, the Black Lives Matter movement was founded by Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. Many of the active protests calls for political change and examples of grassroots activism have been led by Black women. What do you see as the role and or responsibility of women in Africa and the diaspora to affect political and social change?
First of all, thank you so much, Joy, for that question. Please let me know if you're having any issues with hearing me. I don't trust my technology. I'm not very technically savvy. So just let me know if there are any issues. And thank you everybody else for joining us. Thank you, Monashe and Pedro, for such an incredible opening. And I think for introducing this very important global topic, I think that has been on everybody's lips, the Black Lives Movement, what it is about. And I think just trying to understand the implications of racism, of oppression that has existed for generations. And I think we're now living in a century where, as Pedro said, the young people are tired, of living in the predecession of, the elderly generation that to some extent really did fail to uproot, I think, the causes of racism. So as I was just pondering on how best to go about this, the first thing that came to my mind was, for me, it's not political and social change. For me, I think the word that I want to use is political and social transformation. And what do I mean by political and social transformation? That means we're getting to the root causes of these problems and uprooting those, and then dismantling all these institutions of oppression, dismantling all these systems of oppression, and then begin to rebuild a system that works for everybody, and begin to rebuild a system that includes everybody. Because what we see happening with the Black Lives Movement right now is that people are trying to correct, I think, institutions that have been there for forever. So we look at just how America came to be, right? It was founded on the backs of slavery, like racial capitalism. We have to address that and acknowledge that for America to be what it is right now, it colonized these lands. It took it from the Native Americans, and then it built it on the backs of slavery. So getting to the root causes of that and trying to dismantle the systems that have pre-existed, and then acknowledging now the role of women. Where were women in this construction of such structures? Where were Black women particularly in this particular structuring of these systems? So once we begin to understand that, we begin to get to the root causes, we begin to dismantle that, we begin to even acknowledge that, I think we'll find more progress. So the first point that I want to look at is, why was Black Lives Matter even started by women, right? I think for me, I realized that I think Black women are just tired of not being heard. We're tired of not being listened to. We're tired of not being represented. We're tired of not being acknowledged. The struggles that we face in society, they're just thrown right under the rug, and then we're not being given the voice that we need to partake in this transformation of both political and social reforms. So the Black Lives Matter movement, in as much as, yes, it has been for both Black males and Black females, I think it has given the Black females more a voice to stand up, to feel that they're heard, to feel that, hey, we are also here, and we need a seat at the table to partake in the social and political reforms that have affected Black women, and they've been, of course, at the harsher receiving end of this particular spectrum. So with that being said, I also wanted to look at just the brief background of the social hierarchy. We need to look at the social hierarchy, not only in America, but I think globally, where we have the males right at the top. And now kind of just narrowing my focus to America, we see that white males, the systems in America were pretty much created to benefit the white males at large. And right at the bottom of this hierarchy, that's where we're Black women. And for me, being African and then now being an international student living in America, I'm beginning to realize that African Black women in particular are right at the end of this particular spectrum. And why do I say this? It's because of colonialism, and then it's also because of slavery. So you will see that, I think I like what Pedro did say about how the concept of race is there to divide us, but we also need to acknowledge the fact that within the Black community itself, we're also divided. So you'll find that there's a huge disconnect between Africans and Africans in the diaspora, because Africans in the diaspora see themselves now as being superior than Africans. And because of that disconnect, we're not able to unify and support each other to the maximum capacity or to the maximum extent in order to bring about these reforms and these changes. So even as Munashe said that, you know, like we have these movements that are happening at home. We have, like, for me, I'm also Zimbabwean, we have the Zimbabwean Lives Matter. But why is it that not much attention has been given to the Zimbabwean Lives Matter? Why is that not much attention has been given to even, we had the case of a South African student who was raped and killed by her boyfriend, I think, Uyinene. We had a femicide panel about that. Why wasn't that given as much attention as Breonna Taylor's death? So it's this disconnect that we see between Africans and women in the African diaspora, that until that bridge is kept right there and people begin to unite and people begin to see that we are fighting against the same cause, we are pretty much under the same oppression, though we might be in two different geographical locations, or, you know, we might be in different parts of the world, the cause is still the same and the system is still the same in regards to oppressing women. So you'll find that even the women's suffrage in America itself, it did not have the Black women in mind. It did not have the Black woman in mind. It sought to empower the white females, right? To give them the voting rights. They did not see the Black woman as a woman. They saw those as slaves. It's the same thing with Africa, right? Like when we got our independence from colonialism, they did not see women as being future leaders, but instead they saw women as being wives, as being mothers, as being grandmothers. They did not see us as being the future leaders of the continent. So you will see that there's this huge paradigm shift just happening, I guess, within our systems of firstly identifying that we have a problem that oppresses women, but particularly Black women. And within the context of that Black community, there is oppression amongst ourselves. And with that, I also then got to ask myself the question that, why is it that, you know, the George Floyd death is getting so much more attention than Breonna Taylor? We find that the Black Lives Matter pretty much peaked because of George Floyd. As Monashe stated, that we saw all these protests all over the world, you know, saying, you know, George Floyd, the I can't breathe hashtag, right? And then that's how the hashtag Black Lives Matter kind of picked up. But we see that in the space of 3 months, we had Breonna Taylor's death and then George Floyd's death. And even during the protests of the Black Lives Movement, we didn't hear much about, okay, where is Breonna Taylor being involved in this particular cause? I was reading an article by the New York Times, and her name is Miss Gupta, and she's pretty much kind of giving us a rundown of why there is that disconnect between the attention that's being given to George Floyd and the attention that was being given to Breonna Taylor. It's because of the patriarchy. And until we begin to recognize that there is that masculine advantage, and there's that masculine privilege that males get over females. And that's now going back to that social hierarchy structure that I was talking about, that right at the peak of it, we have males, right? Though there are white males that are like right at the very top, Black males still also have certain privileges that they get from just being males. And women, because of just centuries of oppression and how the systems have been built, systems of oppression, we've seen ourselves right at the bottom of it. Breonna Taylor, she was killed. She was also murdered, just the same way George Floyd was murdered. But why is it that there's that disparity of attention? Why is it that celebrities even have not been giving much attention to the death of Breonna Taylor? So coming to that, and then now just trying to understand the problems, the causes, which, as I've mentioned, are oppression, right? And then looking at just how the systems have been built, from how countries got their independence to how America became the great America. It has been built on the backs of certain people, where we have the concept of racial capitalism. And now that racial capitalism has divided people within the Black community themselves. So with that being said, I will now go to the solutions, right? The solutions, obviously, the biggest solution that we have to implement and we have to fight for is representation, having a seat at the table, being given the voice that we need in order to bring about this change. Having social media movements is not enough. Taking to the streets is not enough. As Barack Obama said, we need to go and vote. The people who are in the capacity, especially in America where there is a working democracy, right? That needs to be taken advantage of. Black people, particularly Black women, have to go vote. They need a seat at the table in order to bring this transformation of political and social reforms. Because right now, our healthcare, right, we know that the healthcare of Black women is the one that is pretty much undermined because they do not take us seriously. We look at the women incarceration rates. Why is that more Black women are in jails, right? The new Netflix series Orange is the New Black. Why is it that we have these things? It's because Black women do not have a seat at the table. They do not have the voice that they need in society in order to bring this change. So until they begin to take up spaces where they are heard, and until they begin to take up spaces where they can also partake in the policy changes and policy making that will favor African women and also African in the diaspora, I think we'll actually begin to see a more transformative change beyond protest, beyond taking to the streets, and beyond the social media movements. And with that, of course, we need to talk about education. In order for you to have a seat at the table, you need to be educated, right? So we need to increase our investment in female education. And I think this is not only going to college or even just going to high school, getting the typical mainstream education. Vocational training is very important. Empowering a woman, right? By empowering a woman and giving her the necessary tools that she needs to enable her to tackle different societal problems that she faces. We know that education, for me personally, I think it is one of the major keys to kind of thwart poverty, right? We look at this, just the income disparities in America, the gender inequalities also kind of fit into that you have Black women on the poorer end of the spectrum. So in order to thwart that, we need to equip them with the necessary skills and with the necessary information that they need in order to navigate the system, empowering them to be economically independent, right? Empowering them to be socially independent and having access to the benefits that will help them to improve their social development and welfare. And of course, lastly, we need to empower women through dismantling institutions of patriarchy. So our males need to begin to realize that, because they're at the top of this social hierarchy, they are privileged. They have a certain privilege that they have, and they need to acknowledge that and start to actually support their sisters and support the women in their community and give them the space, and the opportunities that they need in order to also climb up in the ladder. So for me, all of this is just a matter of first acknowledging the root causes of why we are where we are, and even with good and commendable movements such as the Black Lives Matter, to see that Black women are still not heard. They're really still not heard. Breonna Taylor, she has been a topic, but comparing that to the attention that George Floyd got, it's not the same. We look at African women. For me, that was pretty much the drive for African Women's League, to create a safe space for African women where they can be empowered. Because at home, it's the same thing. We're underrepresented. You come to America, it's the same thing. You're underrepresented. So where will we get the voice that we need? Where will we get the resources and tools that we need to be empowered? So until we begin to create these spaces, right, for ourselves, and begin to equip each other and bridge the divide within the Black community itself, and come together, knowing that united we stand, but divided we fall. Because Black Lives Matter movement is not just African Americans, it's Black lives everywhere, right? So we need to begin to acknowledge these causes, the root causes, in order for us to construct sustainable and effective solutions that will not only benefit the present generation, but also future generations to come. So it is the responsibility not only of Black people, but also of the allies of Black people that need to acknowledge their privilege, that need to acknowledge that for them to be where they are, that might have come at the oppression of somebody else, and uniting everybody on the front, like literally uniting everybody and working towards a common cause, which is freedom for all, not just freedom for a certain group or freedom for a certain gender, but freedom for all. So with that, I say thank you so much for listening and taking the time to hear me out.
Thank you so much, Chitenda. That was great. So our last question is for Sean, and the question is, we have two questions actually. How do you think the OU community reflects issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement, and what should we be doing locally to combat issues related to anti-Black racism?
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm out of town right now. I'm actually in a project that's going on right now, so I have to step away from that and make space to be a part of this this amazing discussion. So thanks for having me here. I really love what everyone is saying. So before I get into about OU, just some caveats that I want to drop. So when we were talking about Black Lives Matter, I think that we have to look at the work that has definitely been done prior to the existence of Black Lives Matter, and recognize that this struggle, whether it is within the continent of Africa or whether it was in the places where Africans were part of the diaspora, has been fought from the very beginning, even whether it was being televised before television even existed. I think that when we look at like individuals that fought for freedom, for during slavery, running away from being part of slavery, being willing to go back like Harriet Tubman, like Frederick Douglass, a lot of individuals at that time, Nat Turner. There's just a lot of freedom fighters that was at that moment as well that would be considered representation of what Black Lives Mattering, Black lives being oppressed, going up into Marcus Garvey, going up to W.E.B. Du Bois. I think there's just a multitude of Black individuals, men and women, that have been on the forefront of a battle that right now in contemporary times, Black Lives Matter is more of the focal point of what's being represented today. So I don't want to sit there and discredit what has been done before and say, well, Black Lives Matter right now birthed the ideal of recognizing that there has been a racial divide, or racial oppression that has been structured against people of color, particularly when we talk about Black people within this continent, as well as Black people within the continent of Africa or within the diaspora. So I just want to specify that and say that this battle is just a foregoing battle of a system of oppression that has already existed beforehand, and all it does is evolve as it changes with different time frames back before. So now I can get into OU. So for instance, at one point, OU is historically structured to exclude individuals of color, Black people in particular. We're talking about through legation, we're talking about from it being a southern state. We talk about a place of Norman, which is considered a sundown town that you could not exist within. My grandmother, born in 1940, my grandfather, 36, could not come to Norman and be there after the sun goes down. Right now, the crafter of the HR department at OU was the very first resident of OU, Black resident of OU, Dr. George Henderson. So we're talking about it's a system. It's a system that is in place that is working to exclude. And one thing about a system is that you can remove pieces and replace pieces, and the system still functions. So when we talk about OU work to function to overtly exclude people from it. What OU does today is we look at ways of looking at meritocracy to work as a mechanism to exclude today. And we work at ways of recognizing that there was levels of inadequacy with financial support. There's so many different ways that OU right now functions to continuously exclude people of color from either obtaining a degree or even being admitted in the process of obtaining that degree. So I think that as it relates to OU, how does OU function? I think it first functions as it erases. When I think about Black Lives Matter, I think about the forefathers that represented this space before we came here and how it is erasing those narratives. When we look at the climate and we look at the landscape of OU, you don't really see representation of educating people, even in the social learning space, of understanding the history that OU played within excluding people. When we look at the fountain, the statue that was dedicated to Ada Lou Silver Fisher, it's located in a space that no one really even knows exists. When we go into the cafeteria, and ironically, one of my favorite professors is one of the attendees in this, but as she has pointed out to me as well, when you look at the mural that is within the cafeteria in the courtyard, the food court, and you see the legacy of OU. And at the beginning of legacy of OU, you see the crafter, the landscape, how they looked at it, and the students, what they looked like at that time. And somewhere along this portrait, you see the manifestation of people of color. And there's nothing else there. So then when you see it, okay, well, they're there then. Well, where was the representation of these people beforehand? Well, there's no narrative and there's no understanding of that. OU has functioned to not recognize the role that they have played with excluding people. So since you do not recognize, neither do you educate, and neither do you place people in positions of higher administration roles to educate and to dismantle, the system continues to go on. So when we had George Gallagher as president, I remember watching him and listening to him say, well, this isn't the OU I remember at a town hall. This isn't OU that I remember. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, you was at OU in the 70s. The OU that you remember was worse then than it is now. But you have no context there because you was in a bubble. So for me, as it relates to Black Lives Matter within OU, and I'm just gonna go back to the question real quick that was posed. How does it reflect? It reflects in the first part, like I said, it reflects by erasing the narratives that people that existed before then. And you see that in every space where you see individuals say, well, when there's some racialized incidents that occur at OU, the first thing that they fall into is like, well, I don't understand, I didn't know, I wasn't aware. And I think that the way that OU functions to resolve those is by giving classes, by appointing individuals to new positions, and not really critically and analyzing the structure that is designed that OU functions through. At one point, I was working as a GA for through the administration of OU, and one thing that I first looked into is the policies that faculty were being evaluated on. And we look at those policies and procedures for annual evaluation. A lot of them was very outdated. A lot of them was dated back into the 90s. So now you're seeing policies that were not updated to even recognize how OU has changed within the 90s compared to in 2018 when I was first in that position. So one thing that was not also evident is that there was no evaluation of faculty for having cultural sensitivity on subjects. So now you're still working in a place that still functions to some degree to exclude narratives and understanding of individuals that exist at OU that does not fall into the culture that OU has structured that only favors particular individuals. So how do you dismantle that? First off, in my opinion, is looking into Black Lives Matter. I look into it in the ways that where Black Lives Matter, looking at it from an intersectional space. A lot of things that y'all have said here is literally, I don't really have to talk about because y'all already mentioned them. You mentioned Black women. You've mentioned the diaspora people. So when you look at those things, why is it that, well, when we look at Black faculty of color, particularly women, why are they being underpaid? Where is the representation of Black women? Why are they still leaving OU? Why are Black faculty still being not recognized and not paid to the degree of other faculty? Why are we using evaluation systems for faculty that we already know is racially biased? Why are we using student evaluations for faculty and not really recognizing the fact that student evaluations are still prone to evaluate people of color, particularly Black women, and say that they have a racialized agenda compared to a peer who could be white and be seen that, well, they could actually be talking about a subject of race and still have evaluations that's not center them on having a racialized agenda. There's so many levels where OU still functions to exclude. Another way, if we're talking about student-wise, I work at Project Threshold. The students that I work with are individuals that have followed. For you to be my student, that means you are economically disadvantaged, you are first generation, and you have a DRC recommendation. One thing I deal with is I deal with a lot of students at my job that are students of color, particularly Black, and particularly Black as well, that are not able to continue their education at OU because they don't have the financial support. They don't have institutional financial support, and they don't have scholarly financial support, but they have the grades. So I'm having to advocate for students that have 3.0s, or even if they have a 2.0, to even have the opportunity to continue their education at OU because OU still functions to privilege individuals that are already privileged. So we have, I don't know, at one point, OU was the #1 institution in the nation for National Merit Scholars. So now you're giving funding to students even more compared to students that come to OU and they may not have the economical support. They might even have the grades that got them fully in the ACT scores, SAT, so they got them admitted, but they got into the institution. And now they're excelling academically while still dealing with aspects that are holding them back where it comes to not having financial support, and yet they're still trying to prosper, and yet they're still being told by the institution, well, find money. I myself was 3 years out of university before I was able to finish my undergrad degree, purely based on money. There are different ways that OU still functions to exclude students or kick them out. Another way that OU functions through that lens is they will give you what they consider now probationary admission. So they will admit you in the OU and you could take 0-level courses, and those 0-level courses now are outside of Rose State University that's now placed within OU. But these students are since they're on probationary status, they're not technically OU students. OU works in that lens because, and not only just OU works in that lens because now if those students decide to fail, if they flunk out of the institution, it does not hurt OU's retention levels because they were never OU students. So that's another way. So now when we talk about the institution, OU functions as every other institution of higher education in the United States to function to either exclude, look at privileging, and they're competing for levels of, so how's these institutions looking at privileging? They're looking at it from like, well, what students are you attracting? What faculty do you have in the institution as well? Those are the ways that you're trying to, what is the graduation rates at the institution? First time, full time, all these things, they're working to show what this school is. So basically what I'm saying is institutions of higher education, they work to gain privilege by not purely based on just graduation, but exclusionary practices. You look at the Ivy League schools, they turn down thousands of students and thousands of students that try to enroll in there. They only want the best because it's easy for them to graduate, but also the best usually come from places that have financial support. They're not first generation students. But when we look at the landscape of the United States, we still have African-American students and other students of color that are first generation students. We still look at the fact that K through 12 systems are not equally yoked to educate students to be even able to successfully take successfully take ACTs and SATs to be admitted into institutions of higher education. So what do we do to change these? What do we do to look at these? First off, for me, is I think that one thing that a few of y'all have already said is that we have to have representation. We have to have people in positions. And it doesn't just mean hiring new faculty. It means that giving these faculty the ability to advocate and hiring even new administrators, giving them the ability, giving them support systems to challenge the system itself, even if that system is a system that's paying them. So these are the ways. So how do we sit there and make sure that we have representation is by putting people in those positions, as well as recognizing that these people have to be supported and have to be protected to continue on continue on advocating for people of color. How much time do I have left?
If you want to start wrapping up, I think like 1 more minute should be fine.
Okay. Well, just one last thing then. One thing that was also mentioned within this is there's a legitimate divide between African Americans and Africans from the continent. And I think instead of looking at how like you mentioned the system of white supremacy, and the one thing that we recognize how white supremacy functions, as well as looking into the media, when we look at the space where who's holding the prism that we are both piercing, like we're both looking at each other through. When, for instance, when I was in my undergrad, there was a moment where we actually had a sit down between African American students and African students who are basically about the divide between us. There are definitely stigmatizations that we both throw at each other that still exist today. And the sad thing about those stigmatizations, they are not created by us ourselves. They already was a design. So for instance, when you look at the news, when you look at the media in America, like Malcolm X said, the media is the most strongest entity in the world. It has the ability to make the guilty look innocent and the innocent look guilty. You look at what we're seeing on the media about spaces within the African continent, and they're not glowing. They're never glowing. But on the opposite of that, when we talk about African Americans, they're not glowing either. I've had friends that told me that within their spaces where they grew up from, that we're considered catalysts, we're considered criminals, that we literally, it doesn't function to even understand why we exist in this place that's supposed to be plentiful, and yet we are not prospering. So, but a bigger part to this that I come to realize is that, and this is from Michael Gomez in his book called Exchanging Your Country Marks, is there's a distinguishing difference between being ethnic and racialized. And I think that when we're looking into like the continent of Africa, one thing that holds true is there are some ethnical, cultural things that exist there that is distinguishable between people of color. And one thing that Michael Gomez represents in his book is that when you had those barracoons, when you had those slave boats, and you put all these individuals from different groups, different cultures, different languages on that boat, the one thing that happened in that is that there was a death that occurred. And then there was a rebirth that also occurred. And the death that occurred there was that whatever it was that made you an individual for that space, that made you ethnic, you became racialized before the moment you got there. yes, now when you also in this book he talks about how even then it was very distinct, but even well, the point I'm making is that that racialized identity of viewing black as purely black was birthed from the moment you stepped into that slave ship and was carried above overseas. So now you come from African Americans standpoint, like, well, when people say, well, you sold us into slavery, and then never, well, we didn't sell you into slavery. Why would I sell, you know, but there's a difference. You see, they're constantly putting us against each other, constantly putting us against each other, looking at us as if like we are our own enemies. But this same argument is never placed upon white spaces. When we see World War I or World War II, no one's sitting there saying, this is white on white war, this is white on white crime. No one's saying these things. They're not. Matter of fact, the only time you ever see whiteness literally come to a legitimate like argument against like the treatment of other whites was in World War II because of what Hitler did to the Jews. But then you had Aimé Césaire, who literally said before Hitler existed, there was already Hitlers that was there. Hitler didn't create anything that wasn't already being perpetuated against black people already. The thing about what we experience that we're constantly putting ourselves against, we're constantly being put against each other by systems of white supremacy as well that function to benefit from this divisive tactic. And that's just how it is. And one thing that I would say at the end is that we should really look at how racism plays a role into power systems, because there is never going to be a removal of racism as well as other isms if we can't really understand the structure and the power of capitalism. And how capitalism plays a significant role in even making white people think that they are all privileged. They're not. When we talk about white men, all white men are not privileged. It's not. There's a reason that our president now is able to do things that other white men cannot do. You know, he represents something that's called a WASP, which is white Anglo-Saxon, but that's a whole, we can get into that later on, but I don't think I'm running out of time, but that's all I have to say.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you guys for answering all those questions. Now we're gonna go into the audience questions. For these questions, if you could all just take about like less than 5 minutes to answer so everybody can go. So the first question is there a need in the African context to reformulate or rearticulate the notion of Black Lives Matter, given the racial realities on the grounds of Black majority societies, or should the racial dimension of the appeal remain firmly intact? If any of you want to go first.
Okay, I'll go. I think this goes into what I was saying in my presentation, in that I think at the very root of what we see in terms of the oppression that Black people, Black Africans on the continent are facing, at the very root of that, we need to understand that all of that is racial in its basis, in its foundation, it is racial. So we look at, Sean just mentioned that if you want to understand power dynamics, you also have to understand the way that race feeds into power dynamics, right? And so I think the reality is it is less palatable to say Black Lives Matter in the African context. So I'll give the example of Zimbabwean Lives Matter. It was less palatable to say Black Lives Matter, so let's fight against police brutality, because of that exact question. Well, is it a racial thing if it's Black policemen oppressing or acting as the tool of oppression against other Black people? And so I think it's more palatable to say, oh, Zimbabwean Lives Matter, you know, to try and make it make sense. But truly at the root of the cause, these power dynamics have been put in place by a foundation of racism, a foundation of, you know, if you look at all of these independent African countries, they were independent, and there wasn't a period of transition of trying to decolonize mentally and decolonize institutions and decolonize the function of the state or the definition of the state. There wasn't that period of decolonization of institutions and the state and the dynamic of state and society. There really wasn't that. And so the foundations that colonialism set are the same power dynamics and the same relationships that continue today. And I think another thing that I will say is, if you look at xenophobia as well. It is just the manifestation of internalized racism. It's racism that has been internalized, but then manifests itself, and then we call it, xenophobia, or we call it black on black crime, sometimes. And so I think it's important to understand that the reality of the matter is it may not sit as well, it may not sell as well to say Black Lives Matter when you're talking about the oppression of Black Africans by other Black people, but the reality is it is a racial thing. I believe it is a racial thing. It has foundations in racism, and if we cannot acknowledge that, then we'll be trying to deal with the symptom and not the actual root cause.
Okay, thank you. And now we're going to move on to the next question, just so we can make sure everybody gets their questions answered tonight. Oh, yes.
Oh, well, I was gonna say I can't really I can't talk on that subject as it pertains to the continent. But the one thing that we see that similarly here as it relates to like for instance Freddie Gray, and when Freddie Gray was killed, it's like, well, there were police officers in that car that were Black, and police officers in that paddy wagon that were Black, and so what does that mean? Black, Black on Black. And one thing that the narrative is in America is that when you say, well, police officers are killing us, they automatically, the rebuttal is, well, you're killing yourselves. And I think that when we talk about Black on Black violence or Black on white violence, I think for another aspect, we're not recognizing that there is a system that is still functioning here that works. And I think that, for instance, when we look into the system of right now, we talk about defunding police forces. When we look in the system, knowing that like these institutions that are designed, they're also designed to indoctrinate. And one thing about indoctrination is that you may set a lot of things aside. You may not even be aware of it to even recognize how it functions and how it plays a role into oppressing. There has been I can't remember the name of this individual. Basically what we deal with here in America is we deal with colorism. I think we deal with other forms of dividing ourselves, but not really recognizing that these divisions are still birthed on whiteness. Whiteness still exists in there. These systems still function to separate. When we definitely take a critical lens using intersectionality to recognize how they function and I believe one of the panelists mentioned about how there's oppression within oppression. So oppressed people can oppress people. African Americans, we talk about Breonna Taylor, we talk about George Floyd, we talk about a litany of women Sandra Bland, but there's a litany of women that have lost their lives at the hand of police officers. There's a lot of women that have lost their lives at the hand of other black people that have not been represented. There's a book that's I would recommend called Arrested Justice by Dr. Beth Ritchie, who goes into very descriptive detail about the dangers that African American women deal with within not just society, but even in the Black space. So when it talks about why is it a double standard? I don't think it's a double standard. I think that it's just a way of not recognizing that you can be Black and still play a role in oppressing and still play a role in supporting a system that is oppressing.
All right, thank you so much. So our next question, if any of you want to answer this one, is how can non-people of color help in furthering the message of Black Lives Matter in similar movements without overshadowing the message or overpowering people of color experiences?
All right, I'm going to try to jump on that one because I feel like there's been a lot of misconception, I think, particularly with this generation that, social media is the way to go. Personally, I am not a huge fan of social media advocacy because I feel like it's not as effective as it should be, right? And I think this is a great question for us to answer and try to unpack. For me, I think, as I have mentioned in my presentation, that the people that are in positions of power, right? That have the voice that society will listen to, particularly political positions. Those are the people that need to humble themselves and begin to having conversations with people of color, to hear them and not implement solutions or policies that they think will help them without necessarily hearing what exactly is going on. So this again comes down to like that transformation that I've been talking about, that in order for that transformation to come about, political or social reforms, particularly for the Black community, right? People need to begin to recognize and understand the struggles, right, where this has been coming from. Because I think we look at even the Tulsa race massacres, why this has become a recent topic now, because people are beginning to acknowledge that this was a heinous crime, that this was something that was hidden for several generations and people did not talk about it. So until people begin to acknowledge, have conversations with the communities that are oppressed and the people who are within spheres of influence, begin to have those conversations and actually listen to the people who are oppressed, they will be able to come up with effective solutions that will help to bring about freedom, and also I think acknowledge and just appreciate the experiences. From a lot of conversations that even I as an African has been having with other African Americans, just I think listening to people and really hearing them and understanding, listening to their experiences, because assuming that you know, you don't really know. So having those heart-to-heart tough conversations and affirming their experiences and appreciating what they've been through, I think that might be helpful.
Perfect, thank you. So let me open the next question for everybody. So the next question is, we began 2020 with the threat of COVID-19 and watched as that early warning turned into a global pandemic. What are your thoughts on the relationship between the health crisis and the crisis of racial injustice that have been magnified in the last few months?
If I could give my opinion on that, I think after all this conversation, even whoever has never read about racial inequality, racism, and all that in the US, it's clear that when you are poor, when you don't have any power, almost everything else goes bad in your life. And in the US, race is directly connected to economic power. What happens and what's happening today is a consequence of centuries of oppression of people of color. What's true there is that people of color are those who work in more vulnerable jobs. They are the people who clean. They are the so-called essential workers when everybody else can stay at home. And they're exposed to COVID-19 more than people from any other race. And what is also more important is that these are the people that do not have the right health insurance to treat them or to help them afford their health care. So while they do so much for the country and they're exposed to the disease, they do not have the right health care to take care of themselves. More to that is that these are people who are discriminated, disenfranchised, live in poor neighborhoods where you cannot even properly social distancing, practice social distancing from other people. Whereas white people who are supposedly richer than those who are people of color, they live in bare houses where you can actually practice social distance much easily. In the beginning of the pandemic, I actually read an article that said how the pandemic reveals inequality between college students. And they basically told the story of two college students who went home and then they had different struggles because one was white and had more economic power and the other one was black and had less. And the one who had less obviously suffered the most. So I think there is a very, very significant relationship between race, racism, inequality, and how much impact coronavirus is having on discriminated, oppressed communities in the US, simply because these are the people who are more exposed and have less resources to fight the disease or to take care of themselves. And this is part of the systematic racism, structural racism, aimed to actually weaken these fraction of the population in order to empower those who are white, who are part of the controlling discourse community. So I would say that the link is clear, and obviously, as everybody has said today, there is a lot we can do to actually fight it, which more than protesting, as Tatenda said, is actually go and vote to put the right people in the office so that they can change these laws. Because all this that is happening in the US, it's not illegal. It's actually legal to discriminate somebody. Because some racist people went to the Congress, got the seat, and actually passed these laws that legitimize all these wrongdoings. But these are wrongdoings in our idealized minds, because the law actually permits many of these officials to discriminate people, to deny healthcare on basis of race. They will not tell you that they are doing it on basis of race. They'll say the law says so. You know how people are denied affordable care, how some people cannot just even enroll for simple healthcare because they earn this much or because they have an underlying condition. These are all forms that some people use to deny you certain rights. And many of these things are actually legal. They are written in some law that passed in the Congress, sometimes state laws, other times federal laws. So I think if we want to change anything, we have to put in the office people who can actually write other laws to replace these ones. Thank you.
I just wanted to jump real quick on that and give a side comment on what Pedro said. I 100% agree with everything that he said, and I wanted to outline the issue of racial capitalism, giving a comparison between the manifestation of coronavirus in Africa and the manifestation of coronavirus here in the United States. I think this is, for me, it's a very interesting parallel that we see such high rates in the United States of America, and it's supposed to be the developed country, right, that has the necessary resources to combat this, and that has the necessary resources to be able to support its population. So the question now is, why is it that there still has been an increase in cases in the United States? It comes down to that divide, and that like everything in the United States is pretty much capitalized. And it's on the basis of race, right? So we see that in this structure, as I've been saying, that in these structures that have been built in America, they've been built on the backs of the oppression of other people. And we see that a lot of people of color are on the harsher end of the spectrum, hence why they're marginalized, hence why they're discriminated, and why they've been affected the most by this, because they do not have access to quality healthcare resources. Why? Because of this issue of racial capitalism. So we find that even with the context of like students going back home and like, you know, this whole thing of like schools shut down and students have to take their classes online, how many people have access to the internet? So we need to start asking ourselves those questions. How many people can even afford to be taking a semester online whilst paying full tuition? So many students might have to take a gap year, and can you afford to be taking a gap year? What happens during that space? So until we begin to understand that this corona issue has really, for me, I guess, zoomed into the small issues that people for a long time have been ignoring, particularly in marginalized community, I think we'll begin to actually make progress in understanding that it's more than just a pandemic. How is it that marginalized people are affected by these pandemics when they happen, and as per geographical location? So that's why I gave this comparison between America, which is the developed country, and it's a country that many people look up to, that, you know, it's supposed to have this under control. But because of that racial divide, and of course, this system that has been created on the backs of the oppressed, it still has high cases. Whereas Africa, that is regarded as having developing countries, we have lower cases of that, because there's more unity, I guess, even amongst the leaders in trying to combat this. So I just wanted to give a quick side comment and add up on to what Pedro said.
Okay,
Joy,
thank you. Oh, yes.
can you please allow me just to add a little bit, if
Yes.
if possible?
I do have a few more questions that I have to ask. Is that's okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so our next question is, in the African context, do we come upon a crisis in terms of the value of Black lives because they are Black lives, or one in terms of a crisis in terms of the value of African citizenship?
Can you please repeat that question? Or maybe put on the screen so I can
Oh,
read.
yes. So it says, in the African context, do we come upon a crisis in terms of the value of Black lives because they are Black lives, or one in terms of a crisis in terms of the value of African citizenship? And then now it's on the screen.
All right, I might be off tangent because I don't know if I got the question right, but I'm going to try to take a shot at it. All right, but I think in Africa, it's more of, I think, citizenship, and I will give an example of the xenophobic cases in South Africa. That it's not a matter of like you being Black; it's a matter of which country are you coming from, right? So the xenophobic attacks in South Africa have mainly been targeted towards foreigners, and these foreigners are not okay, there's another question that just came in, something to do with racial dimensions. Joy, would you please read that for us? Maybe it connects to what I'm about to say. You're muted.
Sorry, for that one as well, it says there is a racial dimension, yes, but what about the socioeconomic aspects to something like xenophobia?
Okay, great. Now I think we're going somewhere. All right. So I think I think when we bring in the socioeconomic context, I think it then makes sense because again, just using the example of South Africa, where we see that Black people, in as much as South Africa is independent, will find that 70% of its economy is run by the white minority, which are like the successors of like, you know, colonizers, the Boers and stuff like that. So we'll find that a lot of these people that are now in these independent African countries, there's that divide amongst themselves, right? That mentality, as Monashe had said, that in as much as we got decolonized and we are independent on paper, our mindsets are still pretty much imprisoned by the racial discrimination, the racial marginalization, and the likes. So that divide has been perpetuated by the access to resources, the access to jobs that Black people have within their own economies. And you know, the richer you are, the more privileged you are. And I think Sean said this very well. And there's an article about it called The Pedagogy of Oppression, that because you were once oppressed and then you get your freedom, you are now also in the position to oppress others. So it's that dynamic within the Black community in itself that once they become socioeconomically empowered, right, they see themselves as superior to those beneath them. And because of that, they're now in a position of power, that power dynamic, to then impose oppression on the other people. So it's a matter of, I think, the access to resources that people have within their own society and the control that they even have of those resources, which I think is the most important. And now it's a power struggle of who has access to them, who is able to control them. Is it the white minority? Is it the Black people? And then within the Black community itself, because of that, I think South Africa, again, there's an xenophobic attack. South Africans say you're stealing our jobs because those jobs are very limited and the economy is operating at full capacity. Why? Because it's being operated by white people. So it's just like a whole chain, I think, that falls into like a domino effect, that this one thing then trickles down to the other, and then it trickles down to the other, and then it kind of just recycles itself. I hope I've somewhat answered that question.
Yes, thank you very much. And now we're going to move on to probably be the last question for tonight. The question is, could it be that we become attached to popular mantras like Black Lives Matter because of their popular appeal in this age of social media? Do we need to consider more carefully their utility and the sort of tweaks we have to make for our respective local circumstances?
I think I'll answer that briefly if I just try to answer that as best I can. And I think, as I mentioned earlier on, I think it is necessary to translate the Black Lives Matter movement to local context and to a local perspective. And I gave the example of Zimbabwean Lives Matter earlier on, which again, is taking the larger concept of Black Lives Matter and protesting against police brutality and oppression, and trying to map it onto what is most relevant in that society. And so I think in some cases, and if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think what they're trying to ask is, sometimes do we just say Black Lives Matter because it's popular, but it's not very relevant to what's actually happening in the society? And I think in some cases that may be the case. In some contexts that may be the case, where what's most relevant may not be to say Black Lives Matter because it doesn't communicate the message most effectively. So like I said, with the Zimbabwean Lives Matter, if we had just said Zimbabwean Black Lives Matter in Zimbabwe, that would not have effectively communicated what the issue was or what the message was, even if, like I said earlier, the oppression that we're seeing from state police and from the state is a function of racism in and of itself. But the title Black Lives Matter may not accurately express that message or accurately transmit what exactly it is that we're trying to address, what exactly it is that we're trying to fight for, as it does in the American context. And I think there's another question that was posed earlier about are the dynamics different because there's a majority of Black people in Africa, in African countries. And so I think to answer that question, I think basically, yes, there are moments where it is more appropriate to call it xenophobia, or more appropriate to call it to say Black Lives Matter, or to say Zimbabwean Lives Matter instead of Black Lives Matter. It's more appropriate to say Africa United. You know, when people were trying to address xenophobia in South Africa, the hashtag, you know, Africa We Are One and all of that, it may be more appropriate to use those other messages to get the message across much more quicker than having to explain. But I think the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. It doesn't have to be, oh, this is an economic issue and then this is a racial issue. Because like Tatenda just mentioned, even xenophobia in South Africa is also racialized, because the 70% of wealth in the hands of white people means the Black people, when they're actually Black South Africans, when they're xenophobic attacks, they're never xenophobic attacks against white foreigners. It is never xenophobic attacks against Indian foreigners. One of the biggest scandals that happened in South African politics was with the Gupta family, that was basically running and controlling state politics. You know, but we did not see a lashing out of xenophobic attacks against the Indians, the Indian community in South Africa. Why? Because in as much as it is xenophobia, it is also very much racialized. It is also very much an internalizing of racism and the structures that allow white foreigners and other types of foreigners that are not Black to succeed or to get such high positions of power in a way that local South Africans, Black South Africans are not able to, you know? And so, yeah, I think if I've answered the question, it may be appropriate sometimes to label it in different contexts, but without completely removing it from the racial aspect of the issue.
I look at Black Lives Matter in a different way to a certain degree. I do agree with everything that's been said about it. It's just the way that I view the word Black in general. For instance, I think that if the name was African American Lives Matter, I think it would be more distinguishable. But when we talk about Black, the way I view Black in general, as I view it from a diasporic, African, I mean a purely Black lens. So when I think about it, I think of it in the sense of, yes, is it a mantra? But I think that mantra is tied to experiences that someone can relate to, someone has experience. So for instance, when I hear Black Lives Matter, and then I see the statue of Leopold II being torn down in Belgium, and it makes sense to me. Because I understand that kind of, the murder, the multiple people that have been murdered kind of leaves people that was genocided under his ruling that has been erased. purely based on a statute that still existed today. The first step was they cut the hands off of the Congolese children that was around him because they tried to create a new narrative about what he did. So it wasn't, I don't think it was needed to change the ideal of Black Lives Matter. I think the ideal of recognizing that Black lives matter regardless of where you're from, because all those experiences are the same. I don't have to sit there and say, well, Black Lives Matter here because we're being killed, because Black Lives Matter in the continent, because whether it is perpetuated by white people or perpetuated by people that look like you, it's still birthed under the undercurrent of a racialized white supremacist model. And I think that right there, when I hear Black Lives Matter, the way I view Black Lives Matter is, and this is just from a lens of me being so like I'm pro-Black. For me, this is it. When I hear Black Lives Matter, I sit there and say, listen, LGBTQ Black Lives Matter. Black women's lives matter. Like, I mean, if I'm gonna be for Black lives, I gotta be for Black lives. And I don't care, like when I think of like the continent of Africa, I think about how, and I don't know much about the leadership, but what I do, the people that I have learned about, the people that I do have followed, is Patrice Lumumba, and how he was murdered just for trying to break away from Belgium, and how that narrative was changed, and how the Belgians didn't apologize for his death until 2008. Or Kwame Nkrumah, you know, who had to go into exile. I think about how Black Lives Matter, period, because regardless if we're talking about the narrative of what goes on within the United States continent, or the narrative that happens in the Caribbean, or the narrative that happens within the continent, or the narrative that happened in England, Germany, wherever it was, Black lives was there, and we all originated from the same space, and yet we've all been impacted, maybe differently. Every space has uniquely been impacted, but yet still it's been impacted by the same system, the same structure that still functions today to oppress Black. So when I hear Black, I don't think of African-American Black. I think of Black in a holistic standpoint.
Okay, thank you so much. So now, if each of you could just take a minute to tell everyone, the audience, what your hopes are for the rest of 2020. So then we can wrap it up.
Can I go first? I think this was a very good conversation. I learned so much, and I think what everybody said was very, very, very important. And just before I say what you wanted, I just wanted to say, and Tatenda said it before, you know, when the oppressed is not completely freed from their oppressor, they become another oppressor. And this is what actually Paulo Freire says on the pedagogy of the oppressed. And this is what happens a lot in Africa. We have gotten freedom from our colonizers, but we have not actually got freed. We are not free because we are still oppressing our own people. And as Munasha and Sean said, this is still a consequence of colonization because their education system still remains in Africa. So what I just want to say to everybody is that everybody can contribute in their own attitude. And as other people say, just stop, listen, learn as much as you can, learn the language, learn the science behind of it, learn the reasons, and then be an advocate. Because when the Black people are empowered, everybody else gets empowered. And the Black Lives Matter movement is not just for Black people. It has spillover effect. Today, we have Pedro here from Africa because people fought in the 60s. The movement that started in the 60s gave way for people from India, people from China to come. When Martin Luther King fought, they didn't fight for Black people only. They fought against the war in Asia. They fought against so many other issues that didn't only pertain to the Black people. So with this, I just want to say that everybody can contribute because everybody ultimately will win if we eventually eradicate discrimination from our own society, you know. So I just hope that everybody remains healthy and that we can survive through coronavirus and all the discrimination, all the racial tension that is going on in the US. And eventually we are all happy and meet again here to basically celebrate.
All right, I'll go second. Pedro, thank you so much. Yes, health is so important for everybody to please take care of yourself, right? Even if people may regard it as being radical, we're really living in uncertain times. So make sure you put your health first and check in on your loved ones, because I think we've all learned that life is short, and we should not take it for granted. Things can literally change overnight, right? So make sure that you are checking in with your loved ones, you're taking care of yourselves and the likes. And just to answer that, my hopes for the future, honestly, I think my biggest one is unity. Not only within the Black community in itself, but within humanity, right? We need to begin to see each other as human beings. We're not divided by race, we're not divided by culture, we're not divided by ethnicity, right? We're one people, right? And we need to begin to recognize that, acknowledge that, and appreciate the beauty in our diversity and the beauty in our differences, and unite towards the causes that divide us and unite towards the causes that oppress us, right? So I was seeing a quote that say that you cannot necessarily change the world, but you can be the change that you want to see in the world, and everything else will follow. So basically, you are the change you want to see in your community. So if it's unity like me, I need to make sure that I am doing the necessary things within my capacity that I can to foster that unity with the likes of African Women's League, or serving in different organizations or different frontiers, right? If it's love that you want to see in your community, then you need to be that epitome of the thing that you want to see manifest. So I believe in this generation. I genuinely believe in everybody who joined us today, in the panelists and everyone, that we can become the change that we want to see. And it's not all dire. Yes, coronavirus has turned the world upside down, but let us look towards a brighter future where humanity comes together and learns from this, I think, downfalls that we've encountered in history and also to present times.
I think my hopes for the rest of 2020, I think I would say, is for us to come out of this stronger than we were at the beginning. I think 2020, if anything, has taught us to prepare for everything and to be ready for whatever comes your way. So I think my biggest takeaway and my hopes for not just myself, but even for the African continent, is that we learn from this experience, that we learn from this year, and that we come out of this year stronger than we were when we began. And that even the conversations that we have about the African continent and about Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent begin to change and grow and learn from the experiences. So we're not back here 10 years from today having the exact same conversations and discussing the same issues, but that we really see growth, and that we take from these experiences and these discussions, and that we learn, and that we do better.
Once more, thank you for having me be a part of this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity. My hope for the rest of the year is pretty much what people have already specified. Definitely stay healthy. Everybody stay safe. One thing that I will say that I find hope in, that I have noticed about what's going on OU's campus, at least compared to what it was like when I was in undergrad, is there's so many individuals that are now linking together and recognizing that together is your voice is way more stronger and you have way more advocacy. And there's things that's happening now that I've never seen before at OU. And I find hope and I find joy within that itself, and seeing how, well, you have so many allies now that are willing to not just talk in private, but talk in public and support and publicly support you as well. The things that was going on when I was in school, it was more of, well, it happened, and it was more normative. It wasn't being addressed and it wasn't being challenged as much as it's going on now. You are my hope. I'm not lying. I love to see what's going on. I look forward to what's going to happen. I look forward to being able to be in there to OU long enough to see things that are going on with the students. Y'all are amazing. And so that's it. That's how I feel about the rest of 2020 and for the foreseeable future. As long as I'm at OU, at least I want to see what I'm seeing now and more.
Well, thank you so much, guys. I'd like to thank all the panelists today and the African Studies Institute for letting this even be a thing. Thank you guys for staying in tune. Is there anything that you'd like to say?
We just want to thank you all. It was an amazing discussion, and I like the complexities of ideas and speaking from so many positions and the heartfelt speaking and the hopes. I'm touched.
Yeah, thank you, Joy, so much for moderating this discussion and organizing everything. It's really been a powerful discussion. Thank you, guys. And thanks to our audience, too. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions tonight.
Yeah.
Yes, we got to get there part 2.